horrified by the executions themselves, or actually more horrified by the fact that the priests are not giving the last rites to the people being executed. And they say the punishment for those priests for not giving the last rites, their spirits are now trapped in Jackson Square for eternity. The Justice right at her 4 times in the chest.
No.
He then shot and killed himself, but Michaela lived minus 2 fingers. She later came back to New Orleans and built those tall apartments. Down up there in front of us, the gold statue in the middle of the street, that is Joan of Arc. And that statue is a gift to New Orleans to France. It is a replica of the statue that stands in front of the Louvre in Paris. The locals, we affectionately call the statue Joanie on the Pony. And Joan of Arc, she is the Maid of Orleans, France. We made her the patron of New Orleans. Now, Joan of Arc, she was famously burned at the stake for being a witch, but obviously she was not really a witch. Joan of Arc, she was simply a woman in a place of high power at a time when women were not supposed to have any power at all. So they branded her as a witch and burned her at the stake to get rid of her. Her story kind of parallels one of the famous figures in New Orleans history, the voodoo queen Marie Laveau. Her reputation has been tarnished by Hollywood. That is kind of a tease, because I'm going to get back to Marie Laveau a little bit later on. So I told you the city was founded by France, 1718. In 1762, we became a Spanish colony. Now, while under Spanish rule, there were 2 disastrous fires here in the French Quarter. The first fire, 1788, I already mentioned, it burned down the church, along with 855 other buildings. Second fire, 1794. And between those 2 fires, over 90% of all the original buildings in our French Quarter were burned down. It was left to the Spanish to rebuild, so most of the French Quarter, as you're looking at it today, is actually Spanish architecture. The Spanish had a few ideas on how to rebuild. First of all, they said we're going to use brick, not wood, because brick will not burn. And that brick they originally used, made from the clay of the Mississippi River, it turned out to be a very soft, inferior brick. If you look over here on the corner on the right, looks like some of those bricks there are eroding away. Second idea the Spanish had was that every building had to have a courtyard in the middle.
What did you say?
It's still burnt. Block, a few courtyards down here, you can sneak a peek back through. Now that first one's on the right. You see an archway opening. There was the old carriageway, so you can lead your horse and carriage right back to the courtyard. Well, of course, not many people use carriages anymore, present company excluded. And that's why they got a Mercedes sitting there now. And more courtyards over here on the left. Look up here on the left of the next carriageway. You can see through to the front of the house. It's much prettier than out here on the street. On the street, you're actually looking at the backs of the houses. The fronts face into the courtyard. Up here on the left, there's just on the ground in front of carriageway stalls for rent. For a long time, they used that courtyard as horse stalls. Now that courtyard is now shared by several residences that surround it. And those courtyards originally served 2 different purposes. First of all, they were kind of a break in between the buildings, so if there was another fire, it was not so easy for that fire to spread from one building to the next. Spanish also said that every courtyard had to have a fountain or a source of water, so you would have easy access to water in case there was another fire. And at the fountains, everybody tell them no. Nobody reenacts the Civil War anywhere in New Orleans. Also, as you run up the elevator to the 2nd floor, right as the elevator doors stood to open, some of the guests catch a glimpse of
oh, girl, somebody in there.
Wow.
I ain't know nobody was in there for real. I saw that on the camera and damn near jumped up out
Coming
of
up here on the right in the next block, a beautiful white building. It comes out to the street that is St. Mary's Catholic Church. And then joins that on the corner, you're going to see the old Ursuline Convent.
Oh, I wish we was here this Sunday.
The
We should
Ursuline
come to one of
nuns
their
that came here
churches.
in 1727 from France to educate the girls in the colony. And this is where they had their original school for girls.
What's that?
The nuns are no longer at this location. It is now the archives of the Archdiocese of New Orleans. It's also a museum. The Ursuline nuns still have a school for girls in the city, but the nuns moved their school uptown, where most of the rich people live nowadays. During the second fire, 1794, the fire was headed out in this direction. The nuns were praying to be saved from the fire. The fire stopped right behind us on the street. We just crossed over. It blew out into the river. So the convent's one of the few buildings that survived the two fires I told you about, and the Ursuline Convent's the oldest building in the entire Mississippi River Valley. Construction finished there in 1753. Museum. Well, sometimes people walk through the archives in the museum at the old convent. They'll hear these cries of babies and young children. And it actually sounds like these cries coming from inside the walls. In the 1800s, it was strict Catholic law. Unbaptized children could not be buried in holy consecrated ground. At the convent, a lot of people shot was which men always went to the left, women always went to the right, because, as you know, ladies always right.
Right.
So we're outnumbered here.
Yep.
Even when they're wrong, you're still right. Life's just easier that way.
Yep.
I'm also outnumbered in my household, so I happen to be wrong a lot. My daughter recently turned 14, so it seems like I'm wrong more and more often these days. Now here on the left, it was the old gymnasium for the Ursuline School for Girls. It later became a gym where they were trained boxers in the city. This is where professional boxing first started in the United States, 1890. Louisiana was the first state in the nation to legalize prize fighting. And the longest boxing match on record was held here in New Orleans, 1893. That was a fight for the light heavyweight championship of the South, fought between Jack Burke and Annie Bowen. And it was billed as a winner-take-all contest. They were fighting for the prize of $2,500. And this fight lasted 110 rounds. The fight started at 9 p.m. It did not end until after 4 o'clock in the morning. By about midnight, most of the spectators had left the arena. The ones who were still left inside had just fallen asleep in their chairs. And by the 108th round, there were no punches being thrown anymore. Both boxers were circled on the ring, waiting for the other guy to fall down. Well, they probably could not even get their hands up at this point. So in the 110th round, the referee called it a draw. And it was a winner-take-all contest. It was called a draw. After 110 rounds, there were 7 hours of fighting. Both boxers went home with no money. So we started out riding around here in the French Quarter. It's the oldest neighborhood in the city. Now, it did not always have the name French Quarter. They originally called this area Rue Carré. Now, that translates to Old Square. It did not get the name French Quarter until later in the mid-1800s. Well, that's when the city had developed into 4 different municipalities. So you had 4 quarters of the city. Of course, the quarter where all the French people lived. Well, that was the French Quarter of New Orleans. And here we're going to turn on the Esplanade Avenue. Now, this is one of the borders of the French Quarter. The area in front of us on the other side of Esplanade Avenue is what's known as Faubourg Marigny. Faubourg is a French word for neighborhood, and the Marigny is what's known as the first suburb in New Orleans. It's where immigrants and freed slaves would first settle in the city. And Esplanade Avenue, this is the oldest street in New Orleans. The reason for that is because it's the shortest distance between the Mississippi River just behind us and Bayou St. John a couple miles in front of us. When the French first landed here, they discovered the Native Americans have been using this route for hundreds of years to transport all their goods between the river and the bayou, from Bayou St. John to Lake Pontchartrain to Lake Borgne to the Mississippi Sound. And that leads out to the Gulf of Mexico. Well, that's why the French first chose this spot to build a city, because you had 2 easy routes out to the Gulf. And these beautiful houses you see here on Esplanade Avenue, they are called the Creole Mansions. Oh, they're not near the size as the big old mansions you'll see up on St. Charles Avenue in the Garden District. But I promise you, these Creole Mansions on Esplanade Avenue, they do fetch a pretty penny as well. It does come at a premium to live here on Esplanade Avenue. See on the right, this Creole Mansion on the corner. It's one of the smaller Creole Mansions on Esplanade Avenue, but it's still beautiful nonetheless. And the lady who built this house in the 1850s, her name was Madame Boujard. And Madame Boujard, she worked as an interior designer for a lot of the wealthy people throughout the city. And Madame Boujard, she was very meticulous, very prideful woman. She wanted to make sure that her house looked better than anybody else's. The lady who now owns the house says Madame Bouchard is still very much present there, and she still makes her opinions known how the house needs to be decorated. It's happened many times. She bought new paintings for the house, hung those paintings up on the poles in the 1800s by the father of the house, the big young man, climbing up, sneaking into his daughter's bedroom. But those spikes are not designed for the past. They are designed for the climb down. And they're called Romeo spikes because you might go up a Romeo, but you are gonna come down a Juliet.
No, you can't put ice on it.
Right here crossing over Dumaine Street. And Dumaine is one of 3 streets in a French Quarter named after illegitimate sons of the King Louis XIV. Those 3 streets are Cantaille, Toulouse, and Dumaine. Well, they're naming the streets here. They said if we're going to have 3 streets named after bastard sons of the King, well then we got to clean it up a little bit. Well, that's why there's a street named after a saint in between each of those 3 streets. Now, coming up here on the left on the next corner is a 3-story house. Got some white lights on the 3rd floor balcony. We're going to take a left turn right in front of it. In the 1830s, the man that owned the house was having an affair with one of his house slaves. Very typical of a man cheating on his wife. He kept leading her along, saying, "Baby, I really love you, or one day I'll leave my wife for you." She kept asking him, "When are you going to leave your wife?" He said, "If I'm really going to leave my wife for you, then you have to prove yourself worthy to me." Well, on the coldest night of the year, he told her, "You got to stay outside up on the 3rd floor balcony all night. No clothes on, no blanket. You stay out there all night without complaining, I'll leave my wife." Early next morning, some other slaves took a check on her. They found a body, cold, lifeless, and there were bruises all up and down the rib cage. So the owner showed up a few minutes later and said, "Oh, well, I'm worried about her because I heard that hailstorm last night." It did not make a whole lot of sense because no one else heard the hailstorm. He was so worried about it. Why didn't he go check on her? And these bruises are only on her rib cage, nowhere else on her body. So you put 2 and 2 together yourself, figure out what happened on the balcony that night. Late at night, if you look up on that 3rd floor balcony, they see a beautiful naked woman shivering. And then up here on the left, the Place d'Armes Hotel. That was the site of the first Louisiana School for Boys. The school also burned down in the fire in 1788. And the other children, one of the teachers died in the fire. The guests in hotels see the young boys in 18th century clothing running up and down the halls with their teacher close behind trying to keep them in line. They also wake up in the morning and find their items in the hotel room having rearranged and items missing. It's like some mischievous kids are trying to play a trick on them. Told that story several times on my tours and had people react. Most recently, I had a couple and wife on board. Oh, the lady told me she was a psychic and she wanted to go past the haunted places. But she told me, "Don't tell me about them until we get right up next to them because I want to see if I pick up on them first." And she did pick up on most of the places. So I pulling up to this house, she said, "No, I don't want to stop here. I really don't like what I'm feeling." I was too curious that I had to ask her, "Well, real quick, can you tell me what's going on?" She said, "I see women inside this house. They've been hung upside down from the ceiling. All of them have their throats slit. All the blood's being pulled into a central vat." And I had to tell her, I've never heard that aspect of the story before, but it does make perfect sense of what they say really happened there. Now, up here, we're going to cross over Bourbon Street.
Okay, it looked nice
before
in
you
there
get too
today.
excited, we're actually going to be crossing over the residential side of Bourbon Street. So, if you did not already know, yes, there is such a thing as the residential side of Bourbon Street. It's called a French Quarter, a living museum. People do live and work full time here. And I always laugh when I'm coming down Bourbon Street on this side. People ask, "Well, hey, where's Bourbon Street?" Yeah, he's standing on it. Walking down that way, that's where all the craziness is. Contrary to popular belief, Bourbon Street does not owe its name to the alcoholic beverage. Well, it actually comes from when France founded the city, Louis XV was the king. His family name was Bourbon. And if you were French, you would say Bourbon. Well, that's how we got our Bourbon Street. I guess they figured they got a street named Bourbon. We'll just build a bunch of bars there. It only makes sense. Most of the streets in the French Quarter, either named after royal families of France or Catholic saints. The next street in front of us couch for the front room of the house, and she put the couch there where she thought it looked the best. And then she comes downstairs the next morning, she's puzzled for a moment because the couch is now sitting on the opposite side of the room. And she stepped back, looked at it, and had to admit, okay, you're right, Madame Major, the couch does look better there. Well, of course, that couch still sits in that same spot today. New Orleans is known as one of the most haunted cities in the country, and a big reason for that is due to the biggest killer in the history of New Orleans, and that was yellow fever. Now, these epidemics of yellow fever lasted about 100 years from the early 1800s through to the early 1900s. But the epidemics really only seemed to occur in the summertime when it got real hot. For a long time, nobody knew what the disease really was or how it was being transmitted. They simply called it the sickness, and they thought it was the miasma. That's what they called the fetid, bad air that was coming from the swamp behind the city, getting people sick and killing them. So to clear out this bad air, they started setting these tar fires with lots of smoke. And they did have some success with that, but not for the reasons they thought. The true vector of yellow fever is the mosquito. It's helping to repel some of the mosquitoes. The worst epidemic of yellow fever was 1853. Summer 1853. Over 10,000 people died of yellow fever just here in New Orleans in the span of about 5 months.
Just going on a tour.
The yellow fever was a very painful, very agonizing way to die. It was also a very quick way to die. You would actually have entire families and households die in a matter of hours. The city originally only had one morgue. When these epidemics of yellow fever started occurring, the city opened up 2 additional morgues to handle the overflow, but it was still not enough room. All 3 morgues became overrun.
Oh, I want to go in the mini mart.
And you ended up with dead bodies piling up higher and higher on the sides of the streets. The mosquito that transmits yellow fever is not native to New Orleans. It's the Aedes aegypti mosquito. People say yellow fever was the revenge of slavery, because an Aedes aegypti mosquito was actually brought to New Orleans in the cisterns of the slave ships from Africa. And we were able to get rid of that Aedes aegypti mosquito with a little handy chemical called DDT. And DDT worked so well, it killed pretty much everything. That's why it's not used anymore. And one thing that DDT did not really work so well against was our native species of mosquitoes. So, of course, we still got plenty of mosquitoes here in New Orleans. But at least we do not have to worry about yellow fever anymore.
Thank God.
Right up there in front of us, a 2-story house there with the green doors, the gas lanterns, and those purple lights in the window. That is the Charles Laveau house. And if the name Charles Laveau sounds a little familiar to you, he was the father of Marie Laveau, the famous voodoo queen of New Orleans. And that building was originally just one story. It was actually Charles Laveau's storefront. Marie Laveau did work in the store for her father. And behind the main building is still a little cottage back there. That's where Marie Laveau lived for a few years as a young adult before she married her first husband, Jacques Paris. And when she married Jacques Paris, she moved into the French Quarter at the address of 1020/1022 St. Anne Street. And you can see through the corner window inside the house, they do have a painting of Marie Laveau. As I said earlier, Marie Laveau, she has gotten a bad reputation from Hollywood. So when you think of her, do not think of curses, zombies, and voodoo dolls. You really want to think of Marie Laveau as an herbalist or even a pharmacist. She was able to use herbs to create remedies for yellow fever and other diseases throughout the city. And she was a very beloved, powerful, and influential person here. It was said Marie Laveau had every politician in the city in her pocket. One of the many sources of her influence was the fact that her father, Charles Laveau, was actually the 5th mayor of the city of New Orleans. Now, people of all walks of life would seek out Marie Laveau for help. Slaves, farmers, laborers, businessmen, politicians, and she did work on a sliding scale depending on your income. Marie Laveau's largest gathering was on St. John's Day. That's the most sacred day in the voodoo calendar. She had a ceremony on the South Shore Lake Pontchartrain. Over 10,000 people attended it. She was such a big deal that when she died, her obituary ran in the New York Times. One of the reasons Marie Laveau was so successful in her voodoo practice is because Marie Laveau was actually a devout Catholic. She was baptized, confirmed, and married in St. Louis Cathedral. She would attend Mass there 7 days a week. And Marie Laveau would incorporate symbols of Catholicism into her voodoo practice to put people's minds at ease that they're not walking into a house of devil worship. Marie Laveau always wore a rosary around her neck, had a statue of the Virgin Mary on her voodoo altar, and she would also use the candles of the saints in her voodoo rituals. Second, maybe more important reason Marie Laveau was so successful as a voodoo priestess is because her full-time profession was a hairdresser. She worked for a lot of wealthy, powerful families throughout the city. Now, ladies, what do you do when you go to the hairdresser? You like to gossip, right? So Marie Laveau was able to learn a lot of the deep, dark secrets of those powerful families and use those secrets against them later on. And Marie Laveau, she had a daughter that was also named Marie. Her daughter also practiced as a voodoo priestess, and mother and daughter looked very much alike. That's why the legend has it Marie Laveau is known to be in two places at the same time, and she was said to be immortal, had an exceptionally long life. In the early 1800s, this one block over to the right, there used to be a mortuary over there, and that's where Marie Laveau was embalmed for her funeral. Where that mortuary used to be is where our barn for our mules is today. See on the right, if you look down this driveway, you kind of see the roof of our barn with the light on it back to there.
This purple.
As I said, it was originally a mortuary. It was also the stables for the funeral horses.
Oh my God.
When our company took over the location, they had to break up those old embalming tables. We still have people that practice voodoo throughout South Louisiana, and you might have seen some of those voodoo shops in the French Quarter. Well, those are, of course, geared for the tourist. Well, the real hardcore voodoo is actually practiced out in the swamps and bayous. Voodoo originated on the coast of Western Africa. It was, of course, brought in with the slaves. And the reason we still have voodoo here, unlike the rest of the South, is thanks to the Code Noir. Well, that translates to Black Code. It was the rules and regulations how slaves were to be treated here. Now, that does not mean that slaves were treated well here. Of course, slavery is a horrible institution no matter how you practice it. We just had a few little rules here in New Orleans that the rest of the South did not. First, most importantly, the Code Noir said that slaves could not be physically abused. All the slaves had to be baptized Catholic. Now, therefore, they could not be forced to do hard labor on Sundays. They got 1 day a week off. Now, slaves could work on Sundays, but that was by their own choice. And if they did work on Sundays, then they had to be paid. Now, even though all the slaves were baptized Catholic, the Code Noir also said they would still be allowed to hold on to their own religions and customs. That's unlike the rest of the South, where they would strip the religions and customs away from the slaves. And here in New Orleans, like Marie Laveau, a lot of them started intermingling Catholicism with their African religions. On Sundays, their day off, the slaves are given a spot known as Congo Square. And Congo Square is now inside of Armstrong Park. That's right behind the French Quarter on Rampart Street at the beginning of the Tremaine neighborhood. And there at Congo Square on Sundays, they would hold their voodoo rituals. They would also set up a marketplace there on Sundays, selling their crafts and goods.
For rent.
Any money they made was selling their goods at Congo Square. Any money they made would work good on Sundays. They could save up their money and buy their own freedom.
Oh my God.
Our freed slave could also buy the freedom of another slave.
Yes. You should play jazz.
And it was really thanks to Marie Laveau, being a devout Catholic, we're doing away with some of the more barbaric practices of voodoo.
Uptown is dead.
She used animal sacrifice in some of her voodoo rituals, and she pretty much always used chickens for that purpose. And they would always cook and eat the chickens afterwards. Before Marie Laveau, it was not uncommon for them to actually use human sacrifice in some of their more important voodoo rituals. So that creepy story I've heard about voodoo comes from one of the history books I read. In that book, there was an account of a plantation owner. One day the slaves came to him and said, "We're very sorry, sir. The son of your very best slave got very sick and died today." He was a little skeptical of their story, so they brought him to the young boy's body. He saw there were no vital signs and no signs of trauma, so he was satisfied the young boy had died of natural causes. Well, then 3 nights later, he's walking around by his house. There's some commotion coming from the back fields, and he starts to go see what's going on. Gets a little bit closer. He can make out the sound of drums and chanting. Well, he eventually climbs up to a tree to get a better view without being spotted. Gets up there. He cannot believe his eyes. He sees all of his slaves huddled around a table, and they're strapped down on the table is the same young boy he had pronounced dead 3 days earlier. The boy is now fully alive, and he watched in horror as they sacrificed this young boy in their voodoo ritual. So what they would do, they had a concoction of herbs they would make up, give it some body, or would make them appear as if they were dead. And then there was an antidote they'd give them about 2 or 3 days later to revive them. And that way they could get away with human sacrifice without being accused of murder. Did not give the person an antidote. They would kind of wake up by themselves about 5 or 6 days later. They would not really be themselves anymore. They'd be a lot slower, unintelligent. Now that's said to be the origin of the legend of zombies. I don't know if anybody saw the 1980s horror movie by Wes Craven, Serpent and the Rainbow. It's set in Haiti, and it features these voodoo zombies. A horror movie. It was very loosely based on a work of non-fiction with the same name. There was an anthropologist from Harvard. He went down to Haiti studying these voodoo practices, and he wrote his book of anthropology, titled it Serpent and the Rainbow. Wes Craven read that book and loosely based his horror movie on that book of non-fiction and gave his movie the same name. While you're here in New Orleans, if you want to go see some real-life zombies, so a little later on, we'll walk up and down Bourbon Street. That's their natural habitat. So, I told you that France founded the city in 1718, and more specifically, we were founded by a French Canadian named Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne, Sir de Bienville. And Bienville is known as the father of New Orleans. Bienville originally came down here from Montreal, Canada, with his older brother Iberville in 1699. And they first came down here looking for the mouth of the Mississippi River. When they finally found the mouth of the river, they landed next to a bayou, threw a little party there, and they realized it was the day before Ash Wednesday, known as Fat Tuesday, or Mardi Gras in French. And they named that bayou Bayou Mardi Gras. Well, that's how Mardi Gras was first introduced to New Orleans way back 1699.
Damn.
Look at this, and it has a thing in it. You see that? A thing on it. So the seeds don't come out. It's like a little thing there, so the seeds don't come out. So the seeds don't come out. Right. They real fancy it. Oh, what?
violently.
so we have to
Ladies and
stop.
gentlemen, welcome to Chicago's
Because this
Midway.
runway is
Please
short,
remain
so we
seated
have to
seatbelts
stop.
securely fastened and all
It was so
carry lamps
smooth,
stowed
though.
until we are safely
Right.
parked at the gate. The captain has turned off the seatbelt sign.